All right, let's go ahead and get started, everybody. Welcome back to the San Francisco Dharma Collective. I'm MC Owens. And tonight, so I received a few questions over the last couple of weeks, and there was sort of a theme. So, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about Buddhism and the body. Yeah, so many of the questions that I got were sort of about maybe Buddhism and yoga, uh, meditation postures, but just sort of like a bunch of different questions that all were kind of pointing to this idea of how to relate to the body. So I thought, oh, that would be a good theme. So we're going to talk about that tonight. And the way that I want to talk about it is I want to continue kind of a theme that it's kind of become the theme of the new Sunday night class. And what it is I want to keep sort of exploring Buddhism. Excuse me. I want to keep exploring Buddhism by looking at the aspect of Sila, of morality, the aspect of Samadhi, of meditation, and the aspect of wisdom, or Prajna. So we're going to explore the body in those three ways, in those three categories. So at first, this may not be what you expected, but as usual, just kind of hang in there, hold on in that sense. So right away, when I mentioned this idea of Buddhism and the body, we might immediately jump to the idea of meditation. Like that might be the first thing that comes to mind is like meditation posture, right? And I want to talk about meditation posture. It's something I don't talk a lot about and, kind of have to go to special classes to hear about it. So we are going to talk about meditation and the body and meditation posture. But again, I want to start by talking about Sila. So once again, Sila is the kind of the idea of morality or ethics in that way. Excuse me. And as I've been kind of doing this on Sunday nights, what I've really been trying to emphasize is the way that Shila, morality, I've been emphasizing the way that it really supports meditation. And there's a really important thing going on in terms of their relationship. And morality and meditation have a lot to do with cultivating wisdom. So, if we go to the aspect of Shila, morality, but we're interested in the body, well, right away, in terms of the 5 precepts, the first precept is about the body. It is about what they would call bodily karma. It is about violence, and it's about killing. It's about not doing it. Now, I I would like to think that we don't need to be reminded of this, but sadly, we apparently live in a world that we need to be reminded of this. It's unwise. It's bad behavior all around. It's no good, folks. So, but I don't want to be a finger pointer in that way. So I want to quickly share a little personal story from moments ago. Moments ago, I was getting ready for class and there was a fly. There is a fly in this room. And I was doing, this is literally moments ago, and the fly landed on my hand and it annoyed me. And I tried to kill it. I confess. I didn't succeed. I didn't succeed, but it was an instinctual, and I'm not trying to make excuses, but it was this just an instinct of Yes, go away, but like go away forever, like stop existing. And that is indeed what a big part of that drive, the drive towards violence. From a Buddhist point of view, we want to keep in mind that it is aversion overdrive, right? Where you are so averse, you want to destroy things, right? So I kind of want to use my little personal confession, my personal example, to really point at how like there's levels to this. And like just because you fortunately like didn't commit murder today, there might still be violent instinctual tendencies. And a big part of Sila is about recognizing those instinctual tendencies. And unlike me, not giving into them, right? Like watching yourself before you act in that way. Okay, so bodily karma, keep it gentle, keep it kind, keep it nonviolent, right? Second precept against stealing. That's also about the body. That is also about bodily karma and how you might use it. So again, we are abstaining from taking what has not been given. Now, the third precept, lying, although it is an aspect of the body, it's normally considered part of vocal karma, the voice karma. So we'll leave that over there for tonight, but no lying. But now let's go to the last two of the five precepts, against intoxication and the precept revolving around sexuality. Also, both of those have to do with the body. But last week, or 2 weeks ago, I should say, I wanted to say a little bit more, and I didn't do it. It just missed the opportunity. But I wanted to say a little bit more about the precept regarding inebriation, intoxication, right? Drinking, right? Alcohol. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about that because definitely that is very much about the body and it's about the way that we relate to the body. But I wanted to kind of actually talk about that precept in a slightly different context. I wanted to talk about that precept in terms of what we might just call consumption, meaning like just taking things into the body. And what I wanted to share with everybody is a sort of way of thinking. And it is a way of thinking. It's a very kind of an older, early Buddhist way of thinking. And I don't encourage this. So I want to make that clear what I'm about to say. I don't encourage it, but I do encourage sort of thinking about this. And what it is that many of you, if you've studied Dharma with me for a while, you've heard me talk about the the difference between like being dependent upon things and the idea of like needing certain things for like joy. And you might have heard me talk about how there's kind of a certain kind of joy or pleasure that comes from whether it comes from food or sex or entertainment or whatever it is, but it's the idea of joy dependent upon things. And what I talk a lot about, it's my understanding of Buddhism, is that there's a joy from being independent. There's a tremendous joy from not needing things, right? Now, as soon as you kind of start to get into that mentality, where you're like, oh, wow, look at that. Like there's dependency, and that's problematic because if I can't get that thing, I can't be happy. It sounds like I'm a little bit kind of enslaved to that thing for my pleasure. So who's in charge here, right? Whereas if I don't need anything and I can just be pleased, I can just be joyful and I don't need anything to produce that joy. Well, that's a very stable place to be, right? The other form where you're dependent upon something, very precarious, very precarious. It could fall apart at any moment. If you are independent, again, it's solid. Okay, so if you get to thinking that way, you actually might start to develop a kind of like a kind of a really deep interest in independence. And what I mean is, and but again, I'm kind of talking about an early Buddhist approach to all of this, so I want to remind everybody of that. But in an earlier Buddhist kind of environment, you might actually not want to be dependent upon food. You might not want to be in that kind of dependent relationship. And guess what? You might not even want to be dependent upon air. You might think I'm joking, but early forms of Buddhism, the deep, deep meditation, they were talking about stilling respiration. And at that moment, when you are not breathing, you're not eating, you are not consuming anything. So that, oh, and by the way, I want to remind everybody, Buddhism, even early Buddhism, was always about the middle way, the middle path. And so this kind of, let's call it abstinence, right? Abstaining from eating, abstaining from even breathing, that was only for certain periods of time as like a deep meditative experience. But in general, of course, the Buddha did not encourage fasting, did not encourage such abstinence. But there were certain moments where it was kind of good for the mind to experience states where it was not consuming anything. That almost there's a way in which that kind of consumption is a habit. And at a certain point, you need to actually stop the habit entirely for a moment. So just wanted to say that there's a way that you could like not focus so much just on the alcohol part of the precept, but just note it could be aspirin, it could be Tylenol, it could be whatever you've grown sort of dependent upon in terms of your, oh, I need it to feel better. So also, obviously, all has to do with the body, how we take care of the body, right? How we relate to the body. And then finally, the fifth precept is very, very, very much about the body, but it's about sexuality. One of the things that I wanted to talk about regarding the body and sexuality in that way, it's another really, I think, a really misunderstood part of Buddhism is the kind of its relationship with sexuality. This is not Catholicism, right? This is not like that the idea that sexuality is like bad or something like that. it has much more to do with the mind. And what it is that there's a certain way in which the Buddha or Buddhism recognizes that this is a biological system. And it's got all kinds of hormones and all kinds of stuff going through it. And, and I'm not even talking about sexuality right now. I'm just talking about the mind and the body. And basically, for Buddhism, basically, there's kind of just two modes of being. You're kind of just either being driven by the biology, and when when hunger arises, you start looking for food. When sexuality arises, you start looking to get laid or whatever, right? The idea being that for many of us at many times, the body's going to body and we're along for the ride. Or the mind can observe the body, not be just along for the ride, but to be observant of it. And there is no better place to do this shift than when it comes to sexuality. And what I mean is that when the libido arises, it can take over the mind and you are immediately either whatever, masturbating or engaged in coitus or whatever it is. But there's a way in which you could look at those feelings. Notice them, like really explore them. Try to like really identify in your body where the stimulation is coming from. What does the stimulation actually feel like? Like, is it warm? Is it cold? Is it tingly? Like what exactly? And my point is that the sexual desire, whatever, the libido, it's going to libido. It's going to do it. And you can either kind of become obsessed with that and follow it to its conclusion, or you could observe it in that way. And so the fifth precept, if you ask me, is about being more observant of those things and not just constantly driven along by them. This isn't about good or bad, icky, evil. It's not about that. It's actually about stabilizing the mind. Which is going to bring us to the next category of meditation. But any questions, comments, or ideas about Sila and the body? Noe?
Yes, I like the idea of witness. But I'm always the wit to be in this to be here witnessing because sometimes I get caught up in all of it, like the flow state, like
Sure.
witnessing a flow state, whether cooking. So just that idea of also the joy and rapture in solitude that's even sitting there witnessing sort of so to speak. Hmm? Thank you.
Yeah, Noe. I would let's play that out a little bit. I would actually suggest, based on what Noe just said, I would suggest thinking of sort of three sort of states of being. So what I mean is that it could be that a desire or a feeling, it could be that a desire arises in that way, and we are immediately overcome by it, and we are immediately trying to satisfy it. So that's option number one. Option number two is a more passive, observant, witnessing in that way. But the idea is that there's still this deep, like, sense of the feeling, that a sense that, like, at any moment I could give in to that sensation, but at this particular moment I'm observing it. But there's a deeper state which would be more of that flow state, where there is not any inclination to follow it. There is just a deep witnessing and observing of it. So I would really kind of suggest that there's like three states in that sense. And we're kind of really wanting to get to that third state, right? Where we're really not in any way inclined to give in to this particular, again, it could be anything, but yeah. But great comment, Noe. Gnome, I see you. And then Jordan.
Yeah, another thing, I don't think you said this word, but it's implied in what you were talking about with regard to any of this stuff, but it's especially explicit. Well, you did talk about it earlier. Anyway, is the word choice, that you have a choice, that you're, when you're hungry, you can eat or you cannot eat. And when your libido is
Yep.
aroused, you can do something about it or not. You can, like, you have a choice. That
Yep.
seems like super important.
Yeah, Gnome. And just to follow that through, indeed, there is that moment of choice. And we want to always keep in mind that samskara, right? That idea of conditioning, where it's when these things arise, if the choice is to immediately give into it as quickly as possible, then that's now the habit. That's now the conditioning to immediately give into that as soon as possible. But
Right. And so, no, go ahead.
no, no, yeah. And if you stop for a brief moment first, you're now conditioning the pausing, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. So you have the choice. I mean, there's kind of gradations of how much
Indeed.
choice you have.
Indeed.
But the conditioning can only change if through habitual choosing
Repeated.
of something or the other.
Exactly. That's how it works.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, no. Jordan. Great questions, everybody. Great comments.
Yeah, I kind of had a comment on some things you said. Um, because one thing that I've like learned and experienced from doing like longer meditation retreats is that, I've come to a place where it's like don't need anything and I'm independent. And that brings a lot of joy, a different joy than I've experienced living in the real world. It's a beautiful thing. And the pickle I'm in is, I don't know, like trying to how to maintain it when I come back into the real world. And it
Mhm.
seems like what I'm struggling with is like I feel like sort of a dependence on having to keep going on retreats to experience those states, but try to like maintain them, which is tricky, being a householder and living a
Mhm.
real life. And another thing is, the longer I've practiced, the more I've been able to be more of the observer, in which I've found that um, being the most important thing for me is being aware of my mind states and it, recognizing when I'm having anxiety instead of being like in autopilot and controlled by it. Um, that's been really useful for me because if I can like um, point out those things in my head, then it kind of like takes the power away from it in a certain way, you know? So those are a couple things that came up for me that I wanted to share.
Yeah. Yeah, Jordan. And great comments. One thing to mention about integrating, like bringing this back into the real world, as you call it. One thing that I would throw out there, I always kind of like to mention this. based upon Jordan's question or just that kind of comment regarding like being able to access this independence in retreat, but then trying to bring that back, I find that that's actually where there's a big difference between the Mahayana Bodhisattva path and the more go it alone Theravada path, because the Theravada path is very individual based. It lends itself to solitary retreat. And all of a sudden, when you come back in the world and you're with other people, it gets tricky. But if you're kind of on the bodhisattva path where engagement with other people is the practice, now all of a sudden, Jordan, what I kind of my feeling about it is you go, let's say you go on a nice deep retreat, you experience the bliss of seclusion, that bliss of independence that we're describing. Then you come back into the world and you notice your friends and your family suffering from their dependence upon things. And now you could share with them the joy of independence in that way. And so now the practice is now integrated because you're practicing with others. So that just a little sales pitch for bodhisattva-ness. Cool. All right, so we've already been dancing around it and talking about it. So let's move into talking about the body and meditation. So, when it comes to the body and meditation in Buddhism, there's a really important first place to start, and that's with the four foundations of mindfulness, right? So this is the Satipatthana, the four foundations, and the first foundation of mindfulness is the body. So there you have it right there. It's one of the things that I really appreciate and enjoy about Buddhist meditation is that it is, in my opinion, it is not escapist. It is not a kind of a meditation that says like, visualize this and then move into that and like keep going deeper away. Nope, it says come into a full awareness of your embodied experience. That is the first step. Don't run away. Be present. But this is where I want to remind everybody that in the world of Buddhism, there's a difference between what would be called sati, what we translate as mindfulness. There's a difference between sati and dhyana or jhana and samadhi. So there's different levels to this. And so the first thing I want to say is that we're going to start, because this is where the Buddha always starts, it's with mindfulness. So, for those, you all know this, but in case somebody out there doesn't, what is mindfulness? Well, it's the opposite of mindless. So, mindless is like, whoa, what was that? Whoa, where am I? Who are you? Like just utter confusion, bouncing all around. Maybe I'm thinking about the past. Maybe I'm thinking about the future, just all over the place. Versus mindful, focused, not all over the place, focused. So that's sati, training the mind to stay still, stay focused. And the number one way to do that is to begin by bringing your attention to the embodied experience. Now, in terms of doing sati, in terms of focusing, according to the Buddha, this can be done standing, sitting, walking, or lying down. So it can be done. In other words, it doesn't matter what the body is doing at any, it could be driving, it could be in a dentist chair, it could be in meditation, it could be doing anything. And the mind could be mindless and all over the place, or the mind could be focused. So my point is that when establishing focused attention or mindfulness, the body's going to is doing whatever it's doing. It's again, what you might be walking down the street, you might be laying down to go to sleep. Doesn't matter. So the Buddha was really clear that when it comes to mindfulness, it's whatever position the body is in. It's when we're going to start establishing jhana or dhyana. That's when the Buddha starts to give more specific instructions, although they're not as detailed as I think many people would like. What it is the only thing I've ever found out of the Buddha's mouth is to sit cross-legged. That's it. Oh, the breathing. We'll get to breathing. We'll get to breathing. But in terms of posture, and specifically a meditation posture, there's not a lot of yoga in that way in the world of Buddhism. I want to talk about how, where, and when yoga starts to kind of filter into Buddhism. But at least as far as I can tell, in all of the early Buddhist tradition, there is not anything that we would call yoga. There's no asanas, there's no stretching, there's no real pranayama, there's no real breath work. Nope. It's basically about being still and comfortable. In other words, when the Buddha, at least as far as I can tell, when the Buddha says to sit cross-legged, he does probably mean the full lotus position. That might just be inferred, though. But my point is that when the Buddha seems to have said to sit cross-legged, there doesn't seem to have been a lot of technical, like yoga science involved in how that sitting is happening. It's basically about sitting still. All right. Now, the thing that we need to kind of keep in mind is that the lifestyle of the early Buddhists, they didn't eat that much. They were pretty like slender people, let's put it that way, from the diet. They led what we would call a peripatetic lifestyle, meaning a lifestyle of wandering around. So they got a lot of exercise. So what I'm getting at is that there doesn't seem to have been a lot of attention paid to the body because it wasn't about the body. That's sort of the end. That's the bottom line when it comes to like yoga and like complicated postures and Buddhist meditation. At least in the early days, you were trying to basically, in a way, forget about the body. Like you were, in a way, trying to move beyond it. And so the sitting posture was how, like, are you going to get uncomfortable sitting that way? Because if you're going to get uncomfortable in a few minutes, that's going to be a real drag on your jhana. So the early Buddhist prescription for meditation was to just sit cross-legged, bring your attention to the body, and as I think Noe pointed out, the aspect of the body that we are primarily initially concerned with is breathing. The one very interesting thing about breathing, there's two interesting things about breathing. One You've been doing it your whole life, nonstop. But how often are you aware of it? Right? So that's an interesting thing about breathing is that we've been doing it all the time. But the really interesting thing about breathing, if you really kind of get into breath awareness and meditation, you can begin to notice a intimate relationship between your mental state and the way that you're breathing. Meaning, like if you notice that your chest is tight, your breathing is short and shallow, I guarantee you probably have some anxiety and stress that is causing that kind of clenching. Whereas when you've been meditating maybe for a nice long 20 or 30 minutes and the breathing is just flowing in and out so freely, the mind tends to feel very free in that way. So it's a really great kind of practice to use the breath as a focus of attention. Now, regarding, because we're talking about meditation in the body now, if you ask me, and this is the way I teach meditation, the basic goal, as we've been kind of saying all night, the basic goal of this is to become a passive observer. So, in other words, I mentioned the word pranayama, breath work, right? One pretty classic example of pranayama is equalizing the inhalation and exhalation. So you're trying to get it so that you are, let's say, breathing in to a count of, I don't know, 7 or 8, and then making sure that your exhalation is about 7 or 8 seconds. And you're trying to kind of get those evened out. In Buddhist meditation, you're not trying to do anything. If you're trying to do anything, the only thing you're trying to do is not do anything. No, but it's the idea that you really, really, really just want to watch the body do its thing. That's like the Buddhist way, if you ask me how to meditate, is don't do anything. The classic example of this, by the way, it's the disturbed glass of water, right? So this water is all stirred up in this glass. And the question is, how do you get the water to become still, right? Do I stir it the other direction? Do I shake it into submission? No, you just have to wait. In fact, you can't do anything. The water just has to still. And the waters of the mind sloshing all about, if you add stimuli, if you add ideas, it's just going to start more sloshing about. And so the goal is to just observe. And the way that you do that is by locking into the breathing and staying very focused on that in, out, in, out in that way. All right. I have a little bit more to say about kind of yoga, meditation, and Buddhism, but any questions so far about the body as it pertains to meditation? Robin.
Okay. I is there I've read about a sort of if one can get in touch with the subtle energy that is circulating if we're able to relax and be in the present moment. That some a subtle energy that connects us to the present moment.
Well, there are certainly subtle and not subtle energies, for sure. I would suggest that in terms of doing sati, mindful or mindfulness on the body, so kaya sati, mindfulness of the body, we are initially concerned, as I've been saying, we are initially concerned with the least subtle aspect of the body, which is breathing. It is sort of the most out there. It's the most obvious, right? And if you read the Satipatthana Sutta, so where the Buddha outlines how to do this, you begin with the breathing, but then you actually do start to notice the more subtle aspects of the body. So, Robin, what I'm getting at is that sort of tuning in to the more subtle energies of the body is going to very much be a part of the first foundation of mindfulness. But you sort of made it, you put it though in terms of like that maybe specifically the subtle energies will maybe lead us to some more connectedness or something. Is that sort of, did I hear you right? And I would say that in, at least as far as I understand it, it's not just the subtle energies. It's the whole thing that we're trying to get more aware of. And I say that because, you know, an example of an example that the Buddha gives of body awareness. So it begins with breathing, as I've said, but then you eventually start to bring your attention to your organs, where you actually start to become aware of the heart beating. You start to become aware of your actual internal organs, and then you keep going. And this might take years of cultivation, by the way. I don't want to make it sound like you're doing it wrong if you haven't achieved this. This might take years and years and years, but at a certain point, you are aware of exactly where dinner is. You are aware, is it in my stomach? Has it made it to my colon yet? Like you are fully aware. And I'm going to use the word, but don't call me out on it. You are fully aware of yourself. But what you realize in cultivating body awareness, it makes you realize how little you know about yourself, internal and external, in that way. And so, a big part of just the first foundation of mindfulness is actually becoming more aware of the body. And again, the more you do this kind of meditation, the more you realize how little you know about your own body, which is kind of wild, especially if you've been toting it around this long, for a long. It's one thing for a young person to not know too much about their body. They just got it, right? But we've had these bodies for decades and decades. How could we not know where our spleen is, right? So I just want to say that in response to Robin's question, it's not just about becoming sort of connected with subtle energies. It's about being connected with the whole system. Yeah. All right. So allow me then to say a few words about kind of yoga. I'm not an expert, by the way. I do not know a lot about yoga. I know like a little bit in that way. But what I will tell you about is that if you've noticed this, you're not alone. And what it is that a lot of people notice that there's not a lot of instructions in Buddhist sutras and Buddhist texts. The Buddha doesn't, like I said, like I was saying earlier, he says sit cross-legged. That's it. So there's not a lot of what we would call yoga at all in Buddhism. And it has been noted, this lack has been noted. And so what happens is, and just to let me orient everybody if you don't know, right? So the Buddha, maybe around, he's from around maybe 500 BC, maybe 400 BC, but somewhere around there, right? And for centuries, Buddhism is about being basically a kind of a wandering quasi ascetic. You're not again, you're not an ultra ascetic person, but you're kind of, meager in your lifestyle. And you would wander around. And this went on for centuries and centuries. But eventually, Buddhism, as we know it, about around 400 AD. So now we're a good, maybe getting close to 1,000 years after the lifetime of the Buddha, right? So, but a good amount of time. So it's around 400 or 500 that Buddhism starts to make its way up to Tibet, to the Tibetan plateau. And that culture, the Tibetan culture, absorbs Buddhism a lot. And over the next 3, 4 centuries, so 500, 600, 700, 800 AD, Tibetan Buddhism is growing. But Tibetan Buddhism is it's a very unique thing. And it's unique because Tibetan Buddhism is kind of an interesting hybrid of an indigenous Tibetan religion that most people refer to as Bon. So it's part Bon, it's part Buddhism, but it's also a big part what you might call Hinduism. Just good old-fashioned Indian religion that's coming up the Himalayas, and kind of alongside Buddhism. Aspects of Hinduism are making its way up into Tibetan Buddhism. So Tibetan Buddhism, again, is a kind of an interesting hybrid of a few different religions. And what I'm getting at is that because the Buddhist tradition lacks a kind of a physical regimen, it lacks a kind of a yoga, what happens is that in Tibet, the Tibetans sort of take Hindu Indian yoga and start to merge it with Buddhism, which is lacking again, a kind of a physical regimen. In other words, Tibetan Buddhism has a pretty robust yoga, pranayama, asana, kind of a whole world of physical practice that you don't find in any other form of Buddhism in that way. Something that is similar is that if you spend time in mainland China or Taiwan, a lot of Buddhism in Asia, East Asia, China and Taiwan, a lot of that kind of Buddhism has merged with forms of like Tai Chi and Qigong. Once again, because Buddhism doesn't have a physical practice in that way, it sort of adopts Taoist or just Chinese Qigong and Tai Chi, and you get a kind of a mix again in China and Taiwan. So just kind of putting that out there, that Buddhism itself seems to be lacking a physical practice, but it adopts other physical practices. So that's what makes a lot of different Buddhisms different in that way. So, Noe, question about any of that?
Well, in our readings, especially in the Buddha's journey, in Siddhartha Gautama's journey, he went to practice. He went to these masters of the physical form and the mind and body. I mean, hanging upside down in a tree and learning to meditate. This point for me, that was like, oh, well, this is yoga. This is yoga. So that's where I kind of assumed that yoga was a foundation for the Buddha or for Siddhartha. Then, but then of course he got to it and he's like, what else can I do? And they're like, well, you nailed it. What you know, I can't teach you anymore. But I guess that brings me to the idea that this is when I hear the Buddha or talking about that, or when when we learn the teachings, like I just assume that that's the foundation of it. So
No, that's a great, excellent comment. So Noe was relating sort of the life story of the Buddha before his enlightenment. And indeed, he did study what we would call yoga and meditation with many great masters. Indeed, they do seem to have had, or many of those teachers seem to have had a pretty rigorous physical component, whether it's things like hanging upside down from trees and things like that. And there is, I have read, a kind of speculation that the Buddha, having learned all of that, let's just call it yoga, having learned all of that, I've heard speculation that he did then bring it into the tradition, but I haven't seen any signs of it anywhere. It kind of brings me back to a point that I started to make earlier, and I want to kind of reinforce it. If you ask me, the lack of a yoga, the lack of a physical regimen in Buddhism, for me, it's because I think, in many ways, the Buddha was quickly, or he was trying to get you to quickly sort of transcend the body. And in particular, and I really want to emphasize this, I wasn't planning on emphasizing it, but I really want to. In particular, what the Buddha really seems to like, what word could I use? So the Buddha doesn't seem to have been particularly interested in experiences. And what I mean by that is, and I am definitely talking about early Buddhism now. So, but there was an idea that like there was an idea that anything, let's say that if it was something seen or something heard or something smelled or something tasted or something touched, definitely things thought about. But in terms of things seen and heard and all of that, in early Buddhism, there's an understanding and an idea that sensory stimuli is basically delusional and harmful. And so having, excuse me, having any kind of experience is a little problematic in Buddhism. We kind of actually don't want to have experience in a certain sense. We would like to have peace and calm. But the idea that if I got into a good meditation, the idea that if I all of a sudden started seeing something, lights or imagery or whatever, that would be bad. I don't want, no, calm down. And so, going back to my point a second ago, Buddhist meditation seems to want to put the body down. Just let it rest. Let the mind rest. Let it all rest. And so because of that, there doesn't seem to have been a lot of focus on experiences of the body. Like the idea of like or any kind of experience in that way, whether it's kind of a sensation or whatever it is. If you follow the trajectory of the jhanas, of the dhyanic states, they move from having an experience to basically not having experience for a little while. And so if that's where we're trying to get, you would want to sort of stop focusing on the body as quickly as possible. It's the first stop. It is the first foundation of mindfulness, but the goal would be to quickly move on to the second, third, and fourth foundation in that way. So, all right. No comment, question about any of that?
I have a comment that
Yeah.
I would like to hear your comment on. I have always thought that the people in during the time that the Buddha, the historical Buddha was around, were much more physically active and hence embodied than we are now. I mean, just it's pretty like obvious, but even before we sat in front of computers for hours and hours at a time, but even before then. And so it seems to me like the Buddha might have been like, all right, let's transcend the body, but modern people, and I'll speak for myself, need to first get into the body before they can transcend it. And I personally practiced yoga pretty intensively for a couple of decades before I could sit still. And so yeah, so it's not. I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. And like if the Buddha were around now, he'd be like, "Go practice yoga and then come see me in 10 years or something." Yeah.
Indeed, no, I agree. I do think that the a big part of the lack of yoga in Buddhism is because they were sort of naturally yogis in the way that you're describing. I do think that, and I do think part of the reason why even Tibetan Buddhism, 1,000 years later, did develop a yoga was similar, that it was already then there was started, we needed a little bit more lubrication first in that way, for sure. Um, yeah, so I do think, and my own experience, it's funny. I was up in San Francisco last weekend teaching, and if you were up there, or if maybe you watched it, I'm not sure if you could see it online, but it's a funny thing that me personally, I don't do a lot of yoga. I meditate, but I don't do a lot of yoga. But a weird, funny thing happens that when I teach, I wind up in a full lotus position, but I don't like mean to do it. Like it's one of those things that as I'm teaching, I'm like, oh, I would be much more comfortable if I was like locked in like that. And I can't help but feel there's a certain like Dharma energy that then when you really get into the Dharma, the it takes over the body that way. I just personal experience in that sense. So but anyways, no, I do think yes, that certainly as an upaya, certainly as a skillful means that the Buddha would recommend a physical practice of some sort. And the main reason why that would be, I think, and I think it's the main reason why a lot of people do yoga, if we are trying to get to that point where the body isn't a burden, if we're trying to get to that point where we can just forget about the body, yeah, many of us would need to do some stretching and do some pranayama to allow that to happen. Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, cool. All right. Shall we move on to the wisdom, to the prajna? So this will be fun. It'll be fun because we've now been talking about the body, but we've talked about it as it pertains to morality. And I actually think all of that should seriously be reflected upon. Then we talked about the body as it pertains to meditation. But now, what about the body in terms of prajna, in terms of wisdom? Well, there's a number of different places that we could go, but there's one place I think is the most interesting. So, when it comes to the category of wisdom, there's sort of like one, how can I put it? There's like one category of ideas that's really important. And it's the category that we know as the drishti, the idea of a view, right? This is the idea of a worldview, a cosmological view, religious view, political view, you name it, but the idea of a view, right? And prajna, this idea of wisdom, is about understanding views. And when it comes to views, there's one view in particular that is kind of particularly problematic, and it's a particular view that the Buddha talks a lot about, and it's called the Sat Kaya Drishti. The drishti, the view of the real body. So what the Sat Kaya Drishti is, it's the idea of basically like, well, it's the idea of you, but it's the idea of like your true, real body. And what I'm getting at is that in Indian thinking, in Indian religion, at the time of the Buddha, you've heard it before, but it's the idea that this body isn't your real body. This is sort of like on loan, so to speak. Not from a Buddhist point of view, of course. I'm just talking mainstream Hinduism, Indian thinking. But there's an idea that this isn't your true body. But there is the Satkaya, the true or the real body, your real true body. And the Buddha spends a lot of time trying to dissuade people from this idea of a true body. All right. So what it is, and by the way, I wanted to talk about this because in the world of Buddhism, the Buddha, in even talking about this drishti, even talking about the satkaya, the Buddha's talking about something that people are talking about. And he's saying, yeah, there's no satkaya, there's no true body in that way. And I want to tell you more about that. I want to tell you more about the idea of the true body, but you may not even, believe in such a thing, right? And so then you might think, so I don't have the satkaya drishti, right? Because I don't believe in reincarnation, or I don't believe in these things. But you might still believe in the satkaya drishti, or you might still have such a drishti. And what I'm getting at is that you might think this is your real body, not some like astral body or something like that. So what we're really talking about in terms of wisdom, so remember, we're in the third category. We're in the deep end of the pool. And in terms of wisdom, what we want to be exploring, or what I should say is, in thinking about the body in terms of wisdom, we want to be asking, What is that? And I always say this, you've heard it before, but I'll say it again. A very, very simple question is, do you have hands or are you hands? Do you have hands or are you hands? And if you tell me that you have hands, I, of course, want to know what has hands. And you don't get to say me, right? Because that's exactly what I'm asking about. I'm asking about what is it that has hands? Now, if you're that kind of person that says, I have hands, so I own a set of hands in that way. So you're not hands, but you have hands. So let's talk about you then. Not the hands. Let's talk about you. What is the body of that? Because you just told me that that has hands. Oh, so this body is a piece of property of the self. So I want to know about the body of that self, the one that has hands, right? Now, at this point, you could, be imagining what that is, what that self is, and like what the body of that self is. Maybe. But let's imagine that you said, no, 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 no. It's not that I have hands. I am hands, right? So let's say you went with that option that I am hands. Well, if that was your thinking, so at that point, you would be identifying as the body, right? You would be that they are the same thing. The me and the hands are the same thing. But if you are hands, and if I were to cut off the hands, would you cease to exist? No, right? So if you lost the hands, but you're still around, how could you be hands? So now we're back to option A, which is that you have hands, but you aren't the same as the hands. So now let's go back to exploring what is the body of that. Now, at this point, you could just get off the body boat, right? You could just be like, oh, that's a silly way to think. The whole body idea, that's silly. That would be one step closer to abandoning the satkaya drishti, right? That idea of a true body. What I'm getting around is my classic exploration of what do we even think the self is? That's what we're doing right now. Excuse me. So that's the question. What is it that has a body? And what is the body of that? Any thoughts? So part of the problem, if not the problem, it's a way of thinking, and it's a way of thinking that thinks in terms of things or in terms of bodies, right? Because you might think that this is like the body of the pencil, right? In other words, a body isn't just an animal body in that way. So there's a way of thinking that thinks in terms of entities that have bodies, right? And an entity, oh, look, an entity with a body. And you know what? Entities with bodies, you know what thinking that way allows? Discriminating them from other bodies, right? So there's this body, that body. And so there's a really funny way that the mind can function, and it's in terms of entities or things. And what I'm always trying to kind of get across when we go down this line of thinking, I'm always trying to get across that if you look at like my screen behind me, right? I was just talking about the bird and the flower and the tree. But what if I'm talking about the screen? If I'm talking about the screen behind me, there's just one body. It is the body of the screen. But if all of a sudden I'm talking about the bird and the flower and the tree, well, now we have three bodies. And if you throw mine in there, there's four bodies. But wait a minute. It was one body a moment ago. And what I'm trying to get at or trying to point out as usual is that entities, like bodies, they're determined by discrimination. We think that they have inherent objective existence. We think any entity, any body, the definition of being a body is that it exists, like really truly, without my opinion. But I just showed you how bodies are determined by discrimination that way. So now let's go back to the you that has hands but isn't hands. And I was just trying to ask about the true body, like the body of the self that has hands but isn't hands. And of course, the problem is that if we are thinking in terms of entities, then it's like, well, then it has to have a body because it's a thing, and things have bodies. And if mind starts thinking in terms of entities, hear me out on this. This is a wild line of thinking. But if the mind thinks in terms of entities or bodies, then there is an immediate consequence of that way of thinking. Entities or bodies need to be somewhere. So if there is the thinking, if there is the thinking of the self, and the thinking of the self is thinking that it is an entity, then that entity needs to be somewhere. And that's where we get into trouble. Because we either start pointing between the ears and behind the eyes, right? We start either pointing at kind of the brain and saying that I'm in there, but that doesn't make a lot of sense. But I just want you to start noticing that if you think in terms of entities, entities need to be places, and that's why you think you need to be somewhere. And I don't mean like you're late for an appointment, you need to be somewhere. The idea that you're located somewhere, it's a funny idea, right? Thoughts or comments about that funny idea? Yeah, Noe. And
Yeah,
then
great.
Noam, and then Jordan. Yay.
Funny idea. Yes, that's all.
Yay. Noam.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that it's the problem isn't that you're located somewhere. The problem is that there's a you.
That's what the Buddha was saying
That's
all
the Buddha was saying,
along.
right?
I'm just coming at it from
Yeah. So
another interesting, different
they're
angle.
neither my hands or the hands in my, because there's no my, right? It's not
That's
that there aren't hands, it's that there's no me.
that was the problem with it.
Yeah.
Exactly. The me, not the hands were fine.
Hands are fine.
Yeah. Jordan, you got a comment to add?
Okay. Um, yeah, thoughts. Yeah, one thing that I kind of um is interesting to me during like meditation is like trying to pinpoint the self. And one thing that I do is like we're talking about being aware of the organs. And an interesting thing is like if when I pay attention to my organs, it's like they're doing their own thing and I don't have control over them. Or like there's a whole universe of things going on that I can observe that's happening on its own, you know? And it's an interesting thing because it's kind of more for me on a macro level. It's like, well, what do I have control of in this body, sort of thing. So like observing the natural kind of like biological flow of things. And that's one thing I was thought about. It's like, well, the self would be something that I do have control of. And I'm witnessing all this stuff happening without sort of me doing anything. So it's kind of like piecing apart the aspects of the body in more of like a macro level for me. So that kind of like came up for me, and I thought it was interesting. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Sure. The one thing that comes to mind, or actually a couple things come to mind. So you mentioned about observing the organs and noticing that they're just doing what they're going to do, right? And I'm not the self or whatever isn't the me, the self isn't like beat, 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 like telling the heart to beat every time. Yeah, it's just going. And it's going to do it whether I'm aware of it or not. Excellent. So the heart's just going to do its thing. If the breathing, it's going to the lungs are just going to keep doing their thing, right? But the really interesting thing, Jordan, is to go that next level and realize, and the brain's going to brain. And an idea is no different than like a fart in that it's an idea is like something that happens. Now we start to get this delusion that we're doing it, that there's a doer. That's like thinking that I'm beating the heart. But you can observe the heartbeat and you can observe thinking. It's the crazy thing about Buddhism is that idea that you could observe thinking in that way. The one thing that else that came to mind, Jordan, is, the Buddha talks a lot about, especially in the early suttas, he talks a lot about the aggregates, and he talks a lot about the delusion that the body of form is the self. And he says, if the self were you, then you could be like, I want 6 fingers. You should be able to make another finger then. Why can't I make this body like just be healthy if it's ill? And what the Buddha says is you don't have any control over it. So how could it be you in that way? You don't have any control over sensations. So how could sensations like be you in that way? So a lot of great ideas. The one thing that I would question, comment, answer, idea? No.
Just a really quick
Yeah.
thing, something that a teacher of mine taught me is sometime when you're eating, just notice what your tongue is doing.
Another.
And then like if you ever tried like to tell your tongue what to do while it's eating, you would probably bite it, you just can't.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's such it's a funny delusion in that way to think that we are the one doing it all when really so much is autonomic, first of all, right? Like so much is automatic. No,
Yeah, it's the co-arising too, that everything is just coming forth. And I have this idea of, yeah, I, oh, that just showed up over there. Huh, that's interesting, but it wasn't there a moment ago. So, and there's nobody seeing it, but it just nice when it comes forth and I have there's mindfulness. Like, oh yeah, oh duck, here comes the pie. Thank you.
I, yeah, I would love to get into the more dependent origination aspect of this, but I'm going to stay focused on just this, this simple idea of the Satkaya Drishti. And remember, we're over in the wisdom category. So it's about insight, it's about realization. And I would encourage everybody just to like either in themselves or in like just discourse, like public discourse, it's the notion of the real me. And that could be like a spiritual idea of an actual like astral body, or the idea of like the just the idea of the real me. And which is a very spiritual way of talking, a very spiritual way of thinking, this idea of like discovering the real me and being like, and that's exactly what the Buddha is sort of talking about. There's no real you in that way other than this one. Like it doesn't get realer than this. And it's just sort of a whether this is confusing to you and there's suffering, or this makes perfect sense in that it couldn't be any other way. Right. So, all right. On that note, I'm going to call it a night unless there's any other comments, questions, or ideas. Great comments, questions, and ideas, by the way. All right. Then that'll conclude our little chat this evening about Buddhism and the body. Hope I didn't leave anything unanswered, but if I did, you can let me know and I'll bring it up next week. Otherwise, yep, I will be back next Sunday night for another talk. I love getting questions. Otherwise, not sure what I will talk about. So feel free to write or send them.